5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
You're listening to the GHT Overland podcast. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on the GHT Overland podcast.
Lisa, when you think of South Africa, what comes to mind?
Giraffes, lions, and rhinos. And lots of dirt.
Dirt?
Like lots of open, vast land. Not a lot of greenery.
I think a lot of grassland. Like, stuff that you've seen like on National Geographic shows.
Interesting.
Any guess on the population of Botswana?
202,000.
202 exact? Like in all of Botswana?
500,000?
2.21 million people. And in Gaborone, you were closer on that one, 231,592 as of 2011.
Wow.
So says Google.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, a lot different. Like in the bigger perspective, that's not a lot of people for a major city.
Right.
Right? That'd be like in the Portland metro area, a smaller city outside of Portland. But I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Well, I don't think we visualized that many people may live over there.
Yeah, and do yourself a favor. Look up on Google or whatever search engine you use, Botswana, or I retract. Look up Gaborone, Gaborone, and get a load of that picture. Completely different than I can almost guarantee what you're picturing. Looks like a regular, normal big city.
Yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah, totally cool.
So, what is the hottest month?
The hottest month in Gaborone is January.
What?
Well, they're kind of on the opposite side of things than us. So our winter is their summer, and their summer, oddly enough, is our winter. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So a little more information. This is what I found on Google because I'm just a curious kind of person. In Gaborone, the summers are long, hot, and partially cloudy. And the winters are short, cool, dry, and clear. Over the course of a year, temperatures typically vary from 41 Fahrenheit to 89 Fahrenheit. Like I was thinking like it would be closer to like Vegas, like 120 or something. And rarely gets below 34, or in the summer, rarely gets above 97. Now this week I looked up the weather, and it looks like they're having a pretty hot spell right now with 80% humidity.
Ooh.
That's what kind of makes it
sticky.
Not so pleasant. Yeah. So, weather aside, I think overlanding through South Africa would definitely be an epic lifetime experience. There's one story in this episode that Julie tells that, seriously, I have not stopped picturing for almost a month from the time that we talked to him. You are going to love this 2-part interview with Steve and Julie of Venturesome Overland. And before we get too far, a couple notes before we launch the official episode. We are super stoked for this one. This is our first episode in the new 2019 format with more details on each guest's kitchen setup, why they chose the fridge that they chose, details on financing and budgeting. Super excited about that one. And my favorite, more road stories.
I love stories.
So be sure and let us know what you think of the new format. Each episode will probably be longer than normal. We'd love to know how you like the longer episodes, or if you prefer something closer to that 30-minute mark with 3 parts to each interview. Your feedback is important, and we appreciate you listening.
So let's get into the official introduction, and I'm excited.
All right, let's do it. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the GHT Overland Podcast. This is where you get the greatest interviews and insights from overland travelers around the globe, learning from their stories and experiences as we interview overlanders from places like Australia, Africa, the Americas, Portugal, and today, Gaborone, Botswana. And I hope I said that right. You will learn the basics to the advanced in overlanding, so buckle up and get ready for a new adventure. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lisa. Today's featured guests are Steve and Julie of Venturesome Overland, two travelers originally from Missoula, Montana. Steve and Julie have been overlanding southern Africa for the last year and a half from their home and from Gaborone, Botswana, where Julie is a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Botswana. Julie and Steve have been on the teaching staff at Overland Expo East and Overland Expo West and have visited over 20 countries. Julie's travel writing and photography have been featured in the Christian Science Monitor, SA 4x4 Overland Adventure Magazine, Travel Africa, She Explores, and Camus Magazine, The Nature of the West. While Steve is her perfect adventure partner after hiking mountaintops in Italy and Ireland, overlanded through East and Southern Africa with a keen ability to catch things before they hit dirt.
Yes.
Today, we are humbled to have them join us to learn from their experiences and stories of overland travel.
So, without further ado, welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're really happy to be here, and we've listened to a lot of GHT podcasts while we've been on the road, so we're really glad to talk to everyone, and we hope that we can share some insights, and we're looking forward to the questions.
All right, so first of all, we've got to get the name of the city right, so we both kind of messed that up. Give us the right pronunciation, if you would.
Yeah, you bet. It's Gaborone, Botswana, and if you want to feel like you're in the know, you can just call it Gabs, and it's the capital of Botswana. And we've been living here for about 18 months and exploring Southern Africa and more recently East Africa.
That's awesome. All right, so fill us in on any blanks we may have missed in your intro and tell us a little bit more about you guys.
Yeah, so we've been living here down in Southern Africa. I'm, as you guys said, a Fulbright Scholar at the University librarian, actually. That's my profession, and I'm down here teaching future librarians in the Department of Library and Information Studies here at the University of Botswana. So that's been awesome.
That's really cool.
My job has generally been planning our travels around Africa.
That's cool. So you're a busy man. You guys have been around and done a lot of things.
It's been a great opportunity. We totally love it down here.
That's cool. So describe to us where you're at. Like if you were to walk outside right now for all of our listeners so they can kind of paint that image in their head of where you're at in Botswana, what would we see if we stepped outside?
Wow, that's a great question. So Gaborone is a really sort of cosmopolitan modern city. It was only built in the 60s. And so we live in a brick apartment building right by the university. There's a twin building right across the street. There are some yards and small houses behind us with some big tall trees. And right about now, so we're talking to you guys, it's evening here. Right about now, we're usually sitting out on our patio watching the ibises fly home for the evening. They fly over the house every night from wherever they spend the day. And so we usually just sit out there at night and watch the African sacred ibises going home.
That's really cool. And if I remember right, it's, 6 o'clock in the evening for you?
It is.
Yeah, and it's like just after 8 o'clock in the morning for us.
It's crazy.
So I read somewhere that Steve has an ability to drive like a local in any city. So Steve, how do you drive like a local in Gaborone compared to your hometown of Missoula, Montana?
So I think it's funny because I was reading about Lisa, and you said that she had this preternatural ability to find north.
Yes.
And I also have a really highly calibrated internal compass, and
awesome.
And this sort of memory for streets. And so if I drive down a street, I sort of understand which direction I'm headed, and I remember that street almost immediately, so I can find it again and again. And and when we moved here, obviously in Southern Africa, you drive on the other side of the road from the U.S., right? So you drive on the left on the road, steering wheel on the right, and that took some adjustment. But once you get oriented, it doesn't take long for me at all. So yeah, it's just one of those things. I don't know. Maybe you're born with it. Maybe you get to practice a little bit, but those things come together. So yeah, and Gaborone really is a pretty. I think there's a lot of imagery about like really big African cities, like big traffic jams and crazy traffic, and tons of cars piled up. But traffic here is pretty easy. I think you guys live in sort of the greater Portland, Vancouver, Washington area, and traffic is much more chilled out here than it is there. So
thank God.
It's not the case for other places like Addis or whatever, but yeah.
Oh, we got to go. Extra room? Because I'm done with the traffic.
Yes. Yeah, there's plenty. Streets are pretty wide. The drivers are pretty low key. Not a lot of road rage. So it's not too bad.
Oh, wow. It's like
but of course,
polar opposite.
Yeah. Right.
People are super relaxed on the roads, which is great. It makes driving easier.
Yeah. And it reflects the culture in Botswana too. People who live from Botswana are pretty chilled out folks, and that translates. So
that's great.
It might be individually for each of you, but tell us what inspired overland travel for you.
Boy, I think for me, my roots have always been in sort of the outdoors. So I grew up backpacking and hiking. I think a lot of overlanders, particularly from the United States and the Western U.S., I grew up in Wyoming and Montana and Oregon. You spend a lot of time outdoors, and initially that 4x4, the pickup truck, it's a means to an end. It's to reach that trailhead, get to the fishing spot, get to the mountain, and it was a natural transition, I think, for me. When we came to Africa about 4 years ago, on really what I would call our very first overland trip, we rented a Toyota Hilux from a safari company, and we drove around Southern Africa with little to no experience. And maybe Julie can elaborate on that a little bit. But when we returned to the United States from that trip in Africa, I saw the vehicle as a little bit of a different thing. It wasn't just a means to an end. It became, part of the adventure in and of itself. And I think particularly in Africa, where there's very little in the way of hiking or backpacking or climbing, partly because of the wildlife, partly because it's not, in the landscape or in the culture. It was sort of a natural transition, and it was, we never looked back, I guess, just the two of us for sure. But for me personally, that's where the roots lie for sure.
I would agree with that. We would go car camping and backpacking and things like that in the U.S. But that first major overland trip was when we were here in 2015, and I had to come down here for work. And we thought, gosh, if we're going to go that far, we really want to explore the area a bit more. And we were looking at, safari tours and things like that. And Steve would do a lot of research. He's our logistics guy. He's our planner. And I would come home from work in the U.S. and I would look at these safari tours with all these people. And I thought, I cannot do that. Like, I will go crazy if I have to get on a bus and tour around with people. And so he rented this car, and it was like, when we got here and we started driving around, it was like everything clicked into place for me. And it was really almost like a transcendent moment for me. Like, I remember very, very clearly my first night ever in Botswana, in the truck, in the tent, in the Kalahari. I just had this strange sense. I thought to myself, if it's true that what they say, that right before you die, your life flashes before your eyes, I'm going to come back to this spot in this truck with this person. Everything fell into place for me.
That's awesome. Well, it's good, Steve. She wants to go back with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hopefully before we're dead.
That would be nice.
So you stated that it was 2015. Was that your first overland trip, or how long have you been traveling as overlanders?
That was probably the first major one. We had done, you live in the Western US and you travel by car a lot. So we were used to big distances. We were used to using the car as a tool and camping out of it, hiking out of it. But that was the first time where, like Steve said, the car was like a partner. The truck was like a partner with us on this trip. And it just opened up a whole new way of traveling. So that 2015 was probably the year.
And then that was sort of part of the experience we had when we were in Africa the first time. Was we saw no Americans, and this was sort of puzzling to us because we'd always met other Americans in our other travels in other places around the world. We didn't see anyone exploring the wilds of Africa by vehicle while we were here.
Well, we saw a lot of Europeans, but no
Americans. Yeah.
Okay.
And so this inspired us to come up with this course that we taught at Overland Expo about hey, you're an American, you're thinking about maybe traveling in Africa. It's really easy. That sort of pushed us to do more travel, both in the U.S. and then later as we came to Africa to do more travel here in Africa. So,
Okay. Now, did you guys spend a lot of time planning that first overland trip? And would you recommend spending more or less time to our listeners as they're planning their trips?
Our very first overland experience, we actually relied on someone to help us plan that trip in terms of the itinerary, finding places to go.
And the
a professional.
There's a lot of paperwork to overland in Botswana.
Yeah, there's a lot of paperwork.
Oh,
So we got someone to help us with that initial trip, and it kind of made the difference in some ways because that smoothed the way through the border posts, which we'll talk about later. It smoothed the way through the campsites and the permits for the national parks and that kind of thing. But it also was a way to learn about how to do it ourselves. So to answer the question for the listener, I think if you're really new to the experience, relying on an expert, looking for someone to help you, whether it's a friend who has a lot of experience in overlanding or whether it's a professional, that can really make the experience very positive for you, and make sure that everything goes well and that you come home from that trip, whether it's a short one or a long one, saying, I want to do that again. And but then also to learn from that, because I took a lot of that knowledge from that first trip that we gained and was able to do it myself. And that created some independence for us for our most recent adventure that went through East and Southern Africa. So, I think that question of planning, it's great for folks who are just getting into it. Don't be afraid to ask for help, right? But then as you move forward, you get a different experience and a different adventure when you have that knowledge in your pocket and you can do it yourself. And so we've kind of done it from both directions, I think, and it's been rewarding in both ways.
Okay, really good. Now tell us about your current vehicle and any name you may have given it.
So we drive Land Rover Defender 110 200 TDI. Her name is Toto. We bought her last month in Ethiopia, sight unseen from a couple of other Americans. They were rock climbing through Africa from South Africa to Addis in Ethiopia. And we fell in love with her on the Facebook post, and we met her in Ethiopia, and she's our partner now. Yeah, she's a tough truck. She's a tough truck. I like to say she's not going to win any beauty contests, but she's the toughest thing on the road right now.
And did she come with the name Toto, or is that a name that you gave her?
We gave her the name Toto. She's actually had a couple names because her previous drivers and the drivers before that each had names for her. We named her after the band Toto because sometimes we like to blast the song Africa and dance around the house. So she was named after the band.
All right, that's cool. So tell us about your cooking setup and your recommendations for our listeners in putting their cooking setup together.
Our cooking setup is pretty basic in terms of the details. We carry a 5 kilogram propane tank that fuels our 2-burner, propane stove. Pretty basic. We have a Snowmaster fridge. We'll talk about a little bit later, but we carry a MSR Whisper Light as a sort of backup, and additional stove that goes along with that. And then, we have a whole bunch of the usual kitchen utensils that go along with the cooking setup. This is, I think a big question for a lot of overlanders, like how do you feed yourself when you're on the road? And we, coming from a sort of backpacking background, we tend to keep things fairly simple. Fairly few pots, fairly few utensils, fairly few devices that we use. But it is nice to have a couple burners going in the evening and be able to cook a real meal as well. So, it's nothing particularly complex, but it really works.
We keep food in Tupperware containers just in the back. Dry food in one, and like oils and vinegars and things like that in another, fresh food in a third, stuff that doesn't have to be refrigerated. So everything is a place, and there's never too much of it. We just don't carry too much at any one time. We always have staples: rice, lentils, beans, things like that that you can make a meal out of really quickly. But everything has a place. We have a spice. It's just like a shoe that's full of spices and herbs and things like that you can use to kind of dress things up a little bit. So it's pretty straightforward. The organization is the big thing.
Oh, okay. So organizing, making sure that everything fits in its place. And then how did you decide on the 2-burner stove plus the extra MSR stove that you've got?
The 2-burner stove came with the truck.
Okay.
And to be honest, that's what I would have used anyway. I think particularly because in East and Southern Africa, propane is widely available. It goes a long way. A 5 kilogram bottle will get you quite a long ways. We'd like to have the MSR, I think, for 2 reasons. And I think some of your other guests have said this. It's nice to set up a little stove that'll cook something really fast in the morning. If you just want to boil water, you don't want to get everything out of the truck. You don't want to cook an elaborate breakfast. You can just get coffee and go. And that's useful for the MSR. The other thing is just, it's great to have a backup, right? Maybe you lose an O-ring on the hose that connects the propane tank to the stove. Maybe you have another problem. And just to have that extra peace of mind in terms of being able to make a hot meal is great. One thing for listeners who are thinking of traveling in Africa, those little propane canisters that you screw into a jet boil or one of those other sorts of stoves are really common in an American context. The screw-on butane canisters are almost non-existent. So the Whisper Light is great because it's adaptable for pretty much any fuel that you can find. So outside of South Africa or parts of Southern Africa, those butane canisters are really hard to find. So it's good to have them as a backup, but we use propane pretty much every day for our setup. Yeah.
Okay. So it's really good advice to make sure that if you're leaving from, let's say, America or somewhere that uses those small little containers, don't make that plan A and B going into Africa. You may not find those containers there.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're quite difficult. When you do find them, they're pretty expensive.
Yeah, they're really expensive.
Yeah.
Since bringing Toto into your family circle, what's that one thing you value the most, either on or in your vehicle?
I hate to say the fridge because everybody says the fridge, but the fridge is amazing, especially because things are so remote here. Like, you can really get way far away from anything here, and the fridge just gives us extra time out in the wilderness. So for me, it's probably a toss-up between the fridge and the water system, which we can talk about later, because it is a desert down here, and so having water is like a big deal for me. So fridge or water.
And what fridge do you guys carry?
We have a Snowmaster Traveler, 42-liter. Also, we inherited from the previous owners, and it's been extremely efficient. So almost surprisingly so. The battery draw has been remarkably low. I think especially in a vehicle where it doesn't have a lot of insulation and in a climate that's quite hot. I've been super impressed about how efficient it's been. And I think it also hits the sweet spot in terms of size.
Definitely.
Any bigger, and I think it would really impede on a lot of the other space we would need in the vehicle or other equipment. But it seems to, be big enough to swallow all the beers that we need, and the rest of the food that we carry. Julie's a vegetarian, so fresh vegetables are really important. Some of those it helps to have refrigerated over the long run. So yeah, like Julie said, you never know when you're going to find a fruit stand or a vegetable stand or a market. To be able to have that flexibility has been great. For me, I tend to be the more mechanical guy, and my sort of valuable thing that I find in this vehicle over the course of the many thousands of kilometers we drove over the last few months was the little diesel engine. It was incredibly efficient, powerful when we needed it, and I was really quite blown away by how good it was. It started every day and moved us down the road. It's in an older Land Rover, it's not refined, it's not quiet, but it was a reliable partner every day. So and that kind of sometimes flies under the radar when it runs and goes every single day. But I think on reflection, that's the one thing that on this particular vehicle that was really valuable for me. Yeah.
Cool. So anything that you guys originally packed that you never used or removed from your overall setup?
I think we're in a little bit of an odd situation in that when we moved to Botswana, we had 2 suitcases each. So that was it. That was all we had. And coming from sort of a backpacking mentality, we sort of over the years applied that to the way we overland. So we don't pack a lot of extra stuff. Honestly, I can't think of anything that we're like, this is taking up space or weight, or we've just ditched it. Yeah. I mean, we have we brought our hiking shoes down here, which was crazy because like Steve said, that you can't hike when there's like lions around. So things like that, but there's been nothing major.
Yeah. We've really honed it down to a point where I feel like we've trimmed a lot of the excess, I think. And we'll like say on our most recent journey, there was nothing we didn't use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's true.
So everything we brought, we used at least once, and we didn't sort of want for other things, I think. Yeah.
That's good. So maybe for our listeners, if they just set out 2 suitcases and that's all you can take with you, maybe that's really good advice and something people should do.
It totally concentrates your attention.
Yeah, instead of just loading your vehicle from your garage.
Right.
which is too close to the house. Then you take everything with you.
Right.
So what are your current top 2 or 3 destinations, along with a little detail on what made them so special for you?
I think our favorite place, probably hands down, is the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. We love it in there. And there's a lot to explore in Africa. There's a lot to explore in Botswana, but that's the place we go back to over and over again. Maybe because it was the first place that we ever were here, but it's just really stark and open. There's not much there. It's not where you necessarily go for a wildlife experience. It can be very empty. It's very remote. You won't see anybody else there, but it's absolutely beautiful. And sometimes it's like absolutely sublime. So the last time we were there, we were sitting out in the dark around the fire, and there was a lightning storm that was coming through, and the sky was just pink with lightning. So we would hear this, there was this flash of lightning, and then we would hear this big crash of thunder. And then immediately when the thunder died down, this lion roared right by the campsite. And it was just amazing.
Oh, wow.
The Kalahari is interesting because you don't see a lot of people there, but when we see people, they tend to fall into one of 2 groups. They're either wildly in love with the place, or they're super frustrated because it's not a typical safari destination. It's not wall to wall animals and things like that. You have to work for it, which I think is part of the reason we love it. And then Namibia, we love the desert in Namibia. We tend to be desert people, probably for just the same reasons. It's not a popular safari destination. There's not a lot to see in the traditional sense, but everything that you see, every new hill that you come over, every corner you go around is yours. So Namibia, I think, is extra special for us because it was the first place that we saw a giraffe in the desert, where we hadn't expected to see a giraffe. We just came over this rise, and there was a juvenile giraffe with her mom, and it was just totally amazing. And then I guess for the third one, we're from Montana. We love the American West. We've driven all over it, and we really love the West. We love the national parks. We love driving between Montana and Utah. I think, again, going down to deserts, going to see that canyon country and the red rocks. And we love the Utah national parks, particularly Capitol Reef, which is actually not an overlanding place. That's a backpackers park, but the light there is so beautiful. It's so quiet. It's just, those are our special places, I think, the 3 deserts.
Oh, that's coming from a photographer. The light is perfect.
Yeah.
So any tips you have for purchasing fresh meats and vegetables from those small towns and villages that you go through?
We've made sort of an unspoken agreement on this trip to not buy anything in a big supermarket that we could get on the street. There is not a market culture in Botswana, so that was a real adjustment for us when we were driving through East Africa. There's markets everywhere, from big, huge. Addis, I think, has the largest outdoor market in the world, the Mercato, and then little tiny tomato stands just on the side of the road. And so we would just stop and pick up meat and vegetables, usually from women. If I could find women who are selling things, you get really fresh, really tasty, and much, much less expensive. You're going to haggle, and probably you're going to get charged more than you would if you were local. But I stopped at a market or a tomato stall. We were in Ethiopia. I stopped at a tomato stall, and I came away with pounds and pounds of tomatoes for what amounted to 20 cents US. So
Oh, wow.
I would say stop. If you're overlanding, it can seem really scary. You can seem like you don't belong in those places, especially if you're just passing through. You're rocking through in a big truck. But stop and use a few greetings. Explain what you want. Kids always speak English. There's always a kid there who's going to help you figure out where you should want to go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we just keep a little bag in the front seat with some spare change in it. And whenever we see some fresh veg or fruit on the side of the road, we we stop and buy it there. But get things when you see them. I would say that like as a tip to overlanders, because sometimes like I would see a pineapple and I'd be like, oh, I'll get a pineapple the next time I see one. And then we would never see one again. So if you see it and you want it, turn the truck around.
Seize the opportunity when it presents itself.
We made a lot of U-turns.
What's a favorite meal or recipe you enjoy while overlanding?
So I do a lot of the cooking when we're on the road.
He does all of the cooking.
And I think when it comes down to it, our favorite recipe or meal is a pretty simple one, and it's related to the veg stands or the fruit. It's sort of that thought process. You're driving down the road. What am I going to have for dinner? And a lot of times it's what we've found. The phrase online is the pantry pasta. So we eat a lot of pasta on the road. Obviously, it's a super easy meal, but it's fun for me to sort of mull over as we drive down the road. Well, what do we have in the fridge? What do we have in the veg basket there that can go in a pasta? And we always try to make sure we have some onions and some garlic, and usually things like olives, pickles, things you can put in a can or a jar that are preserved and last a long time. And then, like on this trip, tomatoes were in season, pretty much from Ethiopia all the way through Zambia. It was just, the roads were lined with tomatoes. So we ate a lot of meals with tomatoes, and more often than not, that ends up with the pasta, because it's nice to get those carbohydrates at the end of the day. So I think, for me, there's always a base of onions and garlic and oil or butter if it's available, and then that's forms the base, and then you put in whatever you think you've got and sounds good together. And it's always sort of an experiment as you go along, right? And we sometimes do cooking days where we have a day off where we're not driving, and I'll spend a few hours just cooking meals, right? And then we put those in containers and we put them in the fridge, right? And then we have leftovers, and on really long days or hard days, you can just throw something in a pot and you don't have to actively create something. You can eat something you've created in the past.
Yeah, that's got to be helpful.
Yeah.
We do try to keep eggs and bread and mustard, because at the end of the day, if you just can't do anything anymore. If you toast up some bread and throw a fried egg and some mustard on it, you have a pretty decent hot meal, and then you can just go to bed and start over in the morning. I wouldn't say it's a favorite meal, but it's super handy for overlanders to have that one thing that you can turn to when you just don't have it in you anymore.
Yeah. Now, and I know you guys recently talked to Women Overlanding the World. I'm guessing you may have talked to Sunny and Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Ashley, I think, actually. I was talking to Ashley Giordano.
Oh, okay. Very good. So Sunny and Karen told us about a zucchini pasta that they would make. Is that something that you guys do as well?
We haven't. No, we go straight for the real deal. We go straight for the full carbs.
You mentioned pasta, and that was for some reason the first thing that came to mind.
No, that would be much better. We should do that, but
no carbs.
We go for the heavy stuff.
Yeah, they were really into it. So as a vegetarian, I don't know, maybe it should check it out.
I'm planning on it actually, because we did listen to that episode, and supposedly somewhere in the depths of our kitchen back in Missoula, there's a spiralizer. So that is definitely going into Toto when we bring her back home.
How do you guys generally do your laundry on the road?
I do the laundry. Steve sometimes will do it, but he's usually folding up the tent or doing something with the car. So we have a bucket. We have a blue bucket, and I just do it by hand, which is not that we don't have a washing machine in our flat here in Botswana. So we've been doing laundry by hand for 18 months now. So it's not that huge of a deal. We pack very light in terms of clothing, and it's kind of a weird Zen thing, because when I'm doing the laundry, it's a weirdly intimate, oh, here's the shirt, the one long sleeve shirt I have that keeps me this keeps the sun off me. Here's like Steve's pants that he got all greasy from crawling under the car. So you form this weird relationship because you just have so few possessions with you that you form a weird relationship with them.
And then hygiene can be a touchy subject, but do you guys have a shower and toilet setup? Or Julie, maybe from a woman's perspective, what's your recommendation for keeping it simple and hygienic?
That's a great question. A shower setup came with Toto. We never used it once. The previous drivers never used it. We forgot it was there, to be honest with you. It was buried so deep.
It's a very basic solar shower.
It's like a solar shower.
Yeah.
We don't have a toilet set up. We're usually in campgrounds or like way out. And so we just, again, that backpacker mentality, you just like dig a cat hole or, there's a long drop toilet or something like that. I will say the one thing that I have found, like from a female perspective, I don't know if anybody's ever mentioned this on your guys' show, but I tell this to all the women I know who are thinking about overlanding. If you are still menstruating, a menstrual cup is like amazing. Like that changed the hygiene game totally. So if you don't know what they are, look them up online. But they're super easy to work with and it's super hygienic. It creates no trash. So that from the hygiene perspective has been the big thing for me. We shower when we can get a shower in a campground. Otherwise, we'll wash our feet before we go to bed.
And I think we try, and a lot of other folks have mentioned this, I believe as well, but we try to sort of space out, because we don't have a really large vehicle with a ton of water or other, facilities for showering or going to the bathroom or whatever. We do that thing where, every few days we try to get a campground where, you can get a hot shower, you can, use a real toilet. And that sort of resets the clock a little bit in terms of your just personal well-being and on the hygiene front. Otherwise, we're out, like Julie said, we're out in the wilderness with a shovel. But it's
pack in, pack out, burn everything.
That was actually, that was my next. That was my next point. Just be super conscious about how you do that in wild places. And I think, particularly in Southern Africa, especially, it's not especially common to use the toilet out in the wilderness. Usually there's long drop toilets. And so folks aren't always used to that process. And, we've encountered a lot of places where there's toilet paper, strewn across the desert and that kind of thing. And it's good to keep that in mind that, you're in that place temporarily and you want to keep it as pristine as you possibly can. So.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's a really good point. People need to be very conscious about not leaving a trace behind them from, especially like toiletry stuff. That's just so wrong.
Anything you change about your current setup?
We have big long-term plans for the truck. I mean, she's really bare bones. Like she was a work van. There's no insulation, like Steve said. She's rough inside. So we're going to change probably pretty much everything. We'll build a pop-up roof and get a screen and an awning and all that stuff. But honestly, it's like long-term fun stuff to think about. There's nothing immediate that's like, oh man, we need to fix this like yesterday.
Okay. So tell us about that number one biggest challenge you've had to overcome on the road.
Wow. For me, oh man, it's interesting. So for me, oddly enough, East Africa was it took me some time to get used to because, Botswana is about the size of Texas, and there are maybe 2.5 million people here. So it is really, really remote. And East Africa is totally different. There's just a lot of people, a lot more people. And so everywhere we went, even though it looked like there was no one there, there was always someone there. And I'm a pretty strong introvert. So it would be hard sometimes to, pull up at the end of the day and your car is like surrounded by people who are super curious about what the heck you're doing. We woke up on New Year's Day and I stuck my head out of the tent and And one of the night guards from this place that we're camping had brought his whole family down to like show them how our picnic table folded up. And it's fine. It's like harmless. It's all in good fun. It's actually a great way to meet people and talk to people. But for me, it took some time to get used to.
Yeah. And I think especially to go along with that, you have this idea about, well, you're going to be sort of overlanding these places. You're going to have these beautiful campsites and they're in the middle of nowhere. And, you're going to have this sort of, crystallized experience, but you're always in somebody's home, right? You're always in somebody's place. And I think that's intensified in places like East Africa where the populations are very high and, folks are curious, right? About, who you are and what you're doing and why you're there. And we've had so many conversations, sometimes in languages we didn't understand, with people. And, it can be a challenge. I think, when you're used to, like I said, growing up in the American West, you can go to those wild places and not see anyone. And, but it's sort of just readjusting your expectations. But that's not always easy. And
as soon as you do, it's a lot of fun. Like we just had some amazing moments with people, just like across campfires from totally different cultures and languages and places that have just been extraordinary. But it does take a little getting used to when you're really tired at the end of the day and you're just like, I just want to go to bed.
So once you kind of relax, and like, what would be your tips for having a conversation with somebody like that and you don't speak their language?
That is so I would say two things that we did a lot. Pull out your phone if you have a phone. If you have a smartphone. So we both have our phones. They don't work in a lot of places, but you can always get your photos. And it's super easy to, and I did this a lot actually with kids and with adults where there was like no language connection at all. Just start scrolling through your phone and showing like, here's my mom, here's my grandmother, here are our nephews and our niece, and that is like instant connection. And it's also a good way to pick up a little bit of language, because you can say like, here's my grandma. And then you have a little kid saying to you in
Swahili or
Bibi,
French
here's
or
Bibi, it's we lost hours that way with people and then they would like tell us
That's
about,
great.
I have a baby or I have a grandma and it's super easy. And then food, right? Like we spent New Year's Eve on the border of Rwanda and Tanzania, and someone brought over some tea to our campsite. One of the people who worked at the little campground brought over some tea. So we pulled out our one bar of chocolate and just broke it up and just sat around like drinking tea and eating chocolate and smiling at each other. It's really nice.
That's amazing. That must have been a great experience. That's cool. So let's go into border crossings. What are your tips for preparing for border crossings, making sure that you go through them and you're as prepared as possible?
Yeah, I mean, and this is, I think, an important question for a lot of folks, and maybe I'll keep it specific to East and Southern Africa. One of the things that we found was that I think a lot of border crossings in this part of the world are getting easier, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
Okay.
I think a lot of these countries are developing their customs and immigration offices in ways that have made the process a lot less hectic, a lot less complicated, a lot less sort of daunting than maybe we were planning on. Because as a sort of advice question, I did a ton of research and asked a ton of questions to other overlanders about, how did it go on that, Uganda-Rwanda border crossing? How did you get from Ethiopia to Kenya? How did that particular border post go? And so there's a lot of good information out there, but, obviously going to any border, it's always a nervous experience. You need to move from one place to another, and other people have that sort of destiny in their hands. You don't have any control over it. And that's what makes overlanders nervous, is you don't have that control. Where you're used to, when you're on the road, you kind of control your own destiny. And when you get to the border, you can't anymore. And it's a very sort of distinct sort of separation between those two experiences. But boy, we had really, I would say only in our last trip, we only had one border that was even remotely sort of difficult. In
Malawi.
This was the crossing from Tanzania to Malawi. And that was a problem that, like, it was not even of our making.
It wasn't, yeah. They had the car registered in the previous owner's names because they had driven up through Malawi.
The previous owners of the car had driven the car through Malawi, and when it came up in the customs system, it still had his name attached to it instead of mine.
The Central Kalahari Game Reserve is now my favorite mental escape. Think of what that must have been like, having a lightning and thunderstorm go through. Everything goes quiet. Then there's a lion that roars reasonably close to where you're at the campfire.
Sorry, but I'd have to change my pants.
Somehow I knew that was going to come up. And the way that Julie told that story, I'm pretty sure that they were very comfortable with, like, their surroundings, and, like, they weren't thinking he was hungry and looking for lunch.
No, it's just the process.
Because that never came into my little dreamscape. That never even... But as soon as I read that, I knew the first thing you would think was, I'm going to need to go change my underwear.
Well, it surprised me that there's major marketplace to buy food, and then a lot of the tomato stands along the road.
So, like Julie said, the largest market in the world?
Yeah.
Along with little tomato stands.
All over.
Yeah. That was super interesting. And what else? Remember the...
Yeah, to communicate, they would find children, because children would know English.
Yeah, super interesting to know when you go somewhere, maybe to communicate with the kids first instead of the adults, which, at least in our culture, that's going to be the first thing we do, is get eye contact with the adult and start communicating with them. Super interesting that most of the kids are the ones that know English. Helpful to know.
Yeah. Our interview with Steve and Julie of Venturesome Overland is our longer format interview, so we split these into 2 episodes for your downloading pleasure. Don't worry, new episodes are released each Thursday.
In next week's episode, we learn more about the finer details of Steve and Julie's overland setup, discuss financing, and enjoy more road stories from their travels, learning valuable tips and ideas.
Remember, it's a good idea to visit the show notes page on our website at ghtoverland.com/podcasts. Select the Venturesome Overland episode. All the details and helpful links are already there for you.
Yep, and be sure to send your questions, suggestions, and feedback to ghtoverlandpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love it if you would connect with us on social media at ghtoverland. Be sure to share this episode with your friends who enjoy travel off the beaten path.
It would mean the world to us if you'd rate and review the podcast. Give GHT Overland a little iTunes love so we can reach as many overlanders as possible. Thank you, and we will see you next Thursday for part 2 of the GHT Overland podcast with Steve and Julie of Venturesome Overland. Bye.